Woo woo! Welcome to Bible Theory, homie.
Taking the church to the streets, homie.
Say what? Hey, what's up? Thank you so much for joining Bible Theory once again. This is a special episode, and in this episode, we're going to go ahead and talk about the one and only, the myth, the legend, the historical one, aka J.R.R. Tolkien or Tolkien. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but all you Tolkien fans out there, you want to tune in for this one because this one's going to be a bombshell. So let's go. So, how long have you been reading Tolkien?
Probably first read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings as a teenager, so been quite a long time now. And then I did a deep dive into Tolkien kind of scholarship maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and then I had the good fortune to teach a class on Tolkien and the Old Testament here at Biola a few years ago as well.
You know, as a teenager, what was your first impression on it? What was your first thoughts after you read the book?
I don't really remember. It didn't stick with me per se, but I remember just loving it, and I had no problem getting through the books. I read my dad's old copies, and it's just an enjoyable experience to be part of that world.
Questions that need answering.
You've only just arrived.
Yeah, I think my first inclination, I read it to my daughter, and I had the audiobook, so I read it and listened to it and watched the movies, of course, the trilogy and the Lord of the Rings, of course, and I thought it was like I was kind of lost. I was kind of lost. I kind of understood what was going on just a little bit. I understood the characters. I understood the main storyline about a ring. And then I understood the main characters. Like they were small. The dwarves, I understood the dwarves. I was like, okay, so I got the gist of it, but I was kind of lost. Why is Tolkien sometimes so up there for many people where, some people who are not regular readers or regular Tolkien fans, how come they feel lost sometimes?
I am lost.
So the unique part about Tolkien is this world building that he does in the background. And so the beautiful part of it is as you read these stories, say Aragorn sings a song about Beren and Luthien. Well, Tolkien has actually written multiple versions of the Beren and Luthien story. And so when Aragorn sings a song about them, this song actually exists. The story, the world actually exists. So the world building gives a depth to the Lord of the Rings that is just substantial. And of course, to the point where not only did he create the world, he created multiple languages for this world. The Elvish and the Dwarvish and so on in the books are not just random syllables thrown together. He spent hours and hours and years creating these languages. So he's a bit of an unusual author because he's a professor of Old English. He loves languages. So already as a teenager, he was composing languages or composing speeches and delivering them in languages like Old English, Greek, Gothic, like as a teenager, and he learned lots of other languages along the way. And so this love of languages led him to create his own, and then he wanted to know what kind of world would speak these languages. And so he spent the majority of his life building up this world. Now, the problem is it's a huge world, and so it takes some time to learn about this world. And when you first get there, it's all a bit overwhelming because there's so many aspects to this world.
Who was Tolkien and how was he different from any other writer from his time or any other writer since then?
Yeah, so his day job was a professor. So right away, that makes him different. Authors usually don't come out of academia. It tends to be that academics don't write very well. And as I read lots of academic papers, I recognize this. But he is very interested in language. And so how languages work, history of languages in particular, how languages are connected to land and to history and so on. And so this is what draws him to create this huge world. And certainly Star Wars has a universe.
We must be cautious.
Many other places have universes, but much of that is indebted to Tolkien. In a sense, he's one of the first to do that and to do it well. And because he spends most of his life working on this world, like there are volumes and volumes and volumes of different versions of stories related to this world. He never really finishes it in a certain sense. And so many of these writings about Middle-earth are published after Tolkien dies. They're published by one of his children because he could never finalize it. He kept on tweaking it, kept on expanding it, and so on. And so just the scope of it makes it different than most other writers in this genre. He also straddled the land between popular and more academic. So when he started writing, the fantasy genre was pretty lowbrow. It was low class only. And so he raises it to a certain extent and brings in a lot more diverse audience to reading this kind of literature. So between him and C.S. Lewis, to a certain extent, they kind of created this genre we're able to experience today.
I seen this one movie, I forgot what it's called. It's about Tolkien. I'm not sure if it's accurate or not. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's him following in love and then always have a vivid imagination kind of thing. It gives you hints on him creating stuff, but it's mostly about him and his wife, I guess. His wife's point of view. I don't know, or from his mother's point of view. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that one movie if you have seen it?
I have not seen it. I intentionally didn't.
Okay.
But it's generally tonally accurate. It's kind of is the general sense. But there's quite a few historical details that it gets wrong. But the general sense is certainly the case, mixed up with World War I and that kind of surrounding and so on. His life when he was younger was really hard. He was born in South Africa. His parents had moved there a few years before he was born from England. He went back to England with his mom. And while he was there, his dad passed away when he was 4 years old. So he and his brother lived with his mom. And then his mom passed away when he was 12. So he spent his teenage years as an orphan. Of course, World War I came while he was in university. And so he spent a few years in the military during World War I. And several of his closest friends died in the war. And so all of these things together just had, in a sense, a negative impact on him. I can't imagine what life would have been like for him with all of that death surrounding him. But I think at the same time, it formed his imagination in these vivid ways. And so all of these experiences, I think, were important for him.
Now, when was his discovery? Like someone had to look at him and be like, wait, let me read that paper again. This is genius. Like somebody discovered Tolkien. How was that like? And who was that person that discovered him before his books? You know what I mean? That said, hey, this boy has some gifts here. You know what I mean? You know, it's kind of like like a discovery of Joe Montana in high school. You know what I mean? You're like, man, this kid is going to be somebody. You know what I mean? Or MJ. Michael Jordan. In college, you're like, this guy's going to be number one. But he went to number 3, I think. So who was that guy who discovered Tolkien?
Yeah, so his fame starts with The Hobbit. So he starts writing stories about Middle-earth during World War I. But later on, as his kids are growing up, he had four kids, he would tell them stories. And there's a variety of different stories that he tells them. One of them is an early version of The Hobbit, and he ends up writing down part of it and gives it to one of his students to read. And his student is connected to a publisher, and she passes it to the publisher and says, hey, this is pretty good. And so that's the way that he first got published. The Hobbit then got published, and The Hobbit was not intended to be part of Middle-earth. So it was just a story that he told his kids. But even in The Hobbit, there's some hints of Middle-earth. So Elrond, for example, and orcs, it kind of fits in Middle-earth, even though it wasn't particularly designed to be there.
Good morning.
And so the sales of The Hobbit took off, and that's what launched him to fame.
Now, I guess this leads us to, a little bit more personal stuff. I'm not sure if you know any of this, but, I'll be interested to pick your brain on this. And that's more like his family members. You said he was orphaned a little bit. He had kids. How was his relationship with his mom when she was alive? How much of an impact did his mom played on him and his story, world building, imagination, and gift? And, do we know if he has any brothers, or how was his relationship with his kids as a father, just as a natural father, like playing catch or something like that? Or do we know any of that, or any of those facts?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, he was utterly devoted to his mom. He loved her greatly, and her death was quite difficult for him. And of course, being an orphan is hard, especially in that that time period. He and his brother bounced around quite a few different places, far from ideal. He had one brother. They got along well, but it didn't seem like they were particularly close. No obvious breaks or anything like that, but they don't seem necessarily to be best friends either. There's kind of different and go their separate ways a little bit. He marries another orphan, Edith Bratt was her name, and they got married just before he went off to World War I. And he's utterly devoted to her as well. And so the story of their love is something that he talks about, other people talk about as well. But they're very different as well. So she's not part of his academic world. So there's different people, and he kind of lives a separate academic life. But he always lived close to campus. He would come home apparently frequently for lunch and so on. And so he was always there, did lots of stuff with the kids. The kids all seemed to be devoted to him as well. So a pretty harmonious family unit. I'm sure there's things that happened, but as far as we can tell, pretty harmonious family unit. And the kids loved him and were devoted to him, and he to them, and so on.
I got this one question submitted to me, and it was a pretty obvious one. And it's, what kind of Christian was Tolkien? Was he a Methodist? Was he Anglican, Church of England? Was he an atheist? What kind of Christian, if any, was Tolkien, if we could put him on a map?
Prince Edmund, are you a Christian?
So he is thoroughly Catholic.
I'm a Roman Catholic.
Thoroughly.
So
okay.
His mom converted to Catholicism. So after his dad died, maybe I forget 4 or 5 years before she passed away, his mom converted to Catholicism, and there was a pretty strong reaction from the family about that. Tolkien almost goes too far as to say the family's negative reaction to her conversion to Catholicism ended up killing her. And so there's a slight sense of bitterness towards the broader family of how they treated his mom after she converted to Catholicism. And he remains thoroughly Catholic throughout his entire life. Edith, his fiance, converted to Catholicism. That was kind of a condition for marriage. She seems to be less devoted to Catholicism than he was, still very Christian, but not as excited about some of the specific Catholic things, even to the point where Tolkien himself was a little bit underwhelmed by Vatican II. So he's kind of old school. Let's have Mass in Latin. I like the way things are in Catholicism. He would go to Mass almost every morning. That was part of his ritual, was to go to church early in the morning to attend Mass. There's one particular letter that is quite interesting about this. He says, this is after writing Lord of the Rings.
I quote,
I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact, a Roman Catholic. The latter fact perhaps cannot be deduced, although one critic asserted the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel were clearly related to Catholic devotion to Mary. So he, in retrospect, he says, I didn't plan it this way, but in retrospect, he says, maybe Galadriel is kind of like a Mary figure in Catholicism and how people relate to her. And he also talks about lembas bread as related to the Eucharist, because there's one spot in Lord of the Rings where he talks about the lembas feeding the will in a way that sounds kind of Catholic when it comes to the Eucharist. So he's very Catholic, and he highlights these two things as possible Catholic influences even in Lord of the Rings.
So he rejected the Reformation. He rejected that stuff. And dang, like, did he give any kind of like argumentation to be like, I disagree with Calvin on this point, or I disagree with Martin Luther on these points? Like, it was Cardinal Bishop from Rome that convinced me solidly. Like, was there any Catholic cardinal or bishop or any kind of Roman agency scholar that kind of hitched on him and that pulled him to the Roman Catholic point of view?
Catholic.
So after he was orphaned, he came under the care of a Catholic bishop, I think. Mm-hmm. I forget the rank. This particular man was very formative and kind of served as a role model for him. So the kind of experience part, this is what he grew up with. These are the people who loved him, cared for him, and so on. So he describes himself, he wouldn't think of himself as a theologian. He's not going to go around arguing about how Luther is wrong or something like that. So we don't have those kinds of texts. For Tolkien, he's just convinced Catholicism is correct, historical reasons, and so on. And this is one of the differences between how Catholics and Protestants tend to think, is there's different ways of proving truth and so on as well. There is one book he wrote. It's called The History of the Church in England. Unfortunately, it's never been published. So for whatever reason, the Tolkien estate has not published it. And so no one knows what's in this book. So that could be very interesting for answering this question. How would Tolkien view the history of the church in England, especially with the English Reformation and so on? But that's never been published, so we don't know what's in that.
And I also got this question here submitted to us. It says, how close was C.S. Lewis to Tolkien, and how close were they? And, was C.S. Lewis kind of like more than a friend to Tolkien, in a way of like a missionary to Tolkien, maybe, to say, hey, we shouldn't worship Mary, or here's some gentle nudges because I have a little influence on you, kind of thing?
This is a fascinating story. I love that you're asking about this. It's actually the opposite. So when they met, Lewis was an atheist. So Lewis grew up a Christian, but he had walked away and was pretty strongly atheistic. One of their first sets of interactions was a group that read Icelandic myths. And so Tolkien had put this together. Lewis joined them. And this is Icelandic myths in Icelandic. So not just English translations or something. So they would get together occasionally and read these Icelandic myths, because both men loved mythology. They loved talking about these myths.
Legend became myth.
And the story goes that one night, Tolkien and Lewis and another man, Hugo Dyson, I think was his name, they were talking about myths and how much they love myths and so on. And Tolkien made a case for Christianity, in a sense, as the true myth. And so basically telling Lewis, you can have your mythology and you can have truth. Like the story of Jesus, it's like a mythological story, except it's true.
Oh, it's true, it's true.
And so they talk about this. And so Tolkien ends up being instrumental in bringing Lewis to the faith.
Oh, come, all ye faithful.
And so Lewis talks about this in a variety of places later on, like Surprised by Joy and so on. And so Tolkien's discussions of how mythology works and how Christianity might fit into it was significant for Lewis coming to the faith. And then they became good friends. They spent time together with the Inklings, a famous literary group. And so many parts of Lewis's writings were read there. Many chapters from Lord of the Rings were read there as well. And so they spent lots of time together. Unfortunately, they drifted apart later on in life for a variety of reasons. One was the thing we were just talking about. Lewis never became Catholic.
How come you have not been baptized?
And so Tolkien kind of viewed it almost perhaps as a half-hearted conversion. Like, okay, you became Anglican, but why aren't you becoming Catholic? And then there's a few personality conflicts. Charles Williams was someone that Lewis really liked. Tolkien didn't. And Lewis's fame was also problematic for Tolkien. So Tolkien's much more of the view that it's the theologians who should be talking about theology, not us profs. Like, we're just lay people. Let's let the professionals talk about these things. And so Lewis writing things like Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters and so on was kind of horrifying to some extent to Tolkien. And then even Lewis's idea to use stories, maybe there's some sense of Tolkien feeling like Lewis stole his idea. And then Lewis is much more direct in his stories of like Aslan is the Christ figure and so on, in a way that Tolkien doesn't do the same kind of thing. He says, I don't like allegory and so on. And then the final thing was Lewis married an American divorcee, which was just not okay for Tolkien. So for a variety of reasons, they ended up going their separate ways and didn't spend as much time together for the last, I think, decade or two of Lewis's life. But when Lewis died, Tolkien was grief-stricken. He was still special to him as a friend in many ways.
Yeah, that must have been a lifetime experience. To have two people like that in the same room must be really nice, to be on the fly on the wall. If you were a fly on the wall in the Inklings, what question would you propose?
Oh boy. I mean, the stories told about Inklings. And so first of all, there's lots of alcohol. Like they had lots of alcohol, lots of drinking, smoking generally as well. And the conversations would range across a wide variety of topics. So mythology, history, religion. One guy who was there was even a doctor, so medicine and so on. So they would go all over the place. Oh man, yeah, I would want to know some more about these Christianity topics. Like, let's get these guys arguing about some things and just kind of see where it would go, because they loved arguing as well, and so that would have been fun to watch.
Nice. I got another question submitted to me by one of my people, and they submitted and they say, why do you think it's good for Christians to create content like Lord of the Rings? Obviously, we established the fact that Tolkien was a Roman Catholic, and a lot of Protestants would be like, well, Roman Catholics are not Christian because they deny justification by faith alone as the hinge on which Christianity rises or falls. Some theologians would propose, just put that aside for a second, but just Christians in general coming up with content, right? Fantasy content. Why is it a good thing for Christians to engage in such work? Why is it necessary, perhaps? Why should we, I guess? I guess you could come at it from different point of views and different theories. I'd love to hear them.
Gil-galad must be informed.
So I'll give you a Lewis answer and a Tolkien answer. So the Lewis answer is kind of a backdoor kind of thing. So you could talk to a non-Christian about faith things, but they might want to reject you because they're prejudiced against Christianity and so on. But if you tell them a story, they might get sucked in. And so then you can sneak Christianity into the conversation in a sense through the story. And so this is what Lewis is doing in Chronicles of Narnia and so on. Like he's drawing people in through the story. And then in the story, he's telling them pretty clearly Christian truth. And so one reason to create content is to make this appealing world that people want to be a part of. And then in this world, we can show them Christian truth. And I think there's definitely a place for that. Tolkien's much more skeptical about that. Like he's much more of a indirect kind of person. So he's more about just creating a world, creating beauty, and seeing where this world takes us in a variety of ways. So it's less, I'm going to show you Aslan as a Jesus figure in Lord of the Rings, something like that, and more kind of a fundamentally Christian world that we see in Middle Earth.
We must face the long dark of Moria.
Without being able to identify, oh, this is Jesus, and so on. And so it's content creation, once again, to draw people in, but not as a kind of sneak attack. And for Tolkien, it's more the content itself is the good thing being created.
Shall not pass!
And we can be sub-creators. And so this is Tolkien's phrase, God is the creator, and as images of God, we are sub-creators. And so as we create, we are, in a sense, functionally the image of God. We are doing what God has called us to do. And so the content itself is part of the sub-creation that God has empowered us to do.
Yeah, I'm trying to take it down. Like, wow, that yes, indirect, not direct. So why was it that Tolkien didn't like allegory? Because you know, if you study hermeneutics, there's certain things in the Bible that's allegorical. Obviously, the death and resurrection, all that stuff, that's not allegorical. That's historical. That's real. You know what I mean? But there's some stuff that Jesus says, like a parable. You know, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. It's not a legit you know what I mean? Come on.
Get that coming out of my face!
It's not a mustard seed. It's like a mustard seed. It's like an allegory. It's a relationship thing to get you to understand something about the real thing, right? A spiritual reality. So Jesus used parables, an analogy, right? So why did Tolkien was like, nah.
Yeah. So the most famous statement of this comes in the preface to Lord of the Rings, where he says, I dislike allegory in all of its forms. So partially he's overstating the case. He himself uses allegories elsewhere. So his day job is teaching Old English. His favorite text is Beowulf.
Hail Beowulf!
He loves Beowulf. He teaches it all the time at Oxford. And so he's got a translation of Beowulf that's now published. And he wrote an essay on Beowulf scholarship that is still really important for Beowulf scholarship to this day. In that essay on Beowulf, he uses an allegory. And it's clearly an allegory about this tower and taking it down and studying the stones and so on. So he's perhaps being a bit hyperbolic when he says he doesn't like allegory in any of its forms. I think what's going on is he's reacting against a certain kind of reader who wants to find historical parallels to everything in Lord of the Rings.
It's all connected.
So is the ring, say, the nuclear bomb?
Atomic Holocaust!
And is Sauron Hitler, or whatever the case might be? And so to push back against that, I think he, in a sense, is pushing back farther than he actually is and saying, no, allegory is bad. Or what he's saying is, don't try to find historical parallels in Lord of the Rings to current events. That's, I think, more what he's trying to say.
So he's not a dispensationalist. Well, do we know where he falls in terms of the end times, like eschatology? Because that sounds like anti-dispensationalist right there, like hermeneutically.
He would presumably take a Catholic view, kind of amillennial, but he doesn't talk about it in those terms. That's more of a Protestant thing to care about such things. Rather than a Catholic
I
thing.
guess. Yeah, because you have the king returning and conquering and becoming victorious. You have this like theme at the very end where it's like the king actually rules and peace comes, and it's like that's kind of like maybe like a little post-millennialist a little bit, because you have triumph over evil, kings coming back, so it's a little bit more than spiritual, right? It's like a real thing. I don't know.
Yeah, but is that new creation? Is it the millennium? Is it like, so this is where Tolkien would say, don't get too bogged down in the details. Like, yes, there's going to be a king, life is going to be good, and you can argue all you want. Is it new creation? Is it millennium? But he would say, don't try and find too many parallels.
For someone who's listening, they're like, okay, this Lord of the Rings, I never read it. I get it. Tolkien was a writer. He loved languages. He hates allegory and, in that sense. But what is the moral of the story? So if you could just summarize it, all these books, like what is the whole moral of the story? First of all, does all the books connect? Like, I'm not saying like chronologically. I'm just saying like, do you need to read the whole thing to like understand the whole thing? Or can you just read the Lord of the Rings and then you'll be all right? Or do you need to read the whole thing? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, Lord of the Rings is definitely a standalone kind of book. So you don't need to read Silmarillion.
Okay.
But once you read Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, if you love the world, then that Tolkien has created, Middle-earth, then reading the Silmarillion is fascinating because you actually get to read the stories of Beren and Luthien and Turin and how is the world created and all that kind of stuff. So the Silmarillion is a tougher read for a variety of reasons. There's a lot more names. So if you got lost in Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion just makes you even more lost. And there's no hobbits in the sense of there's no hobbit. So kind of the beauty of the hobbits in Lord of the Rings is they're experiencing Middle-earth for the first time along with the reader. So they go to Rivendell.
Welcome to Rivendell, Frodo Baggins.
And they're amazed. They go to Mordor and they're just like horrified. And so they're experiencing the world for the first time with us as readers. So they're kind of mediating Middle-earth to us. Silmarillion doesn't have that. And so it's just harder to engage because you don't have that kind of mediation. But I love the Silmarillion. It's a wonderful book in many ways. The moral of the story is really hard. So I would say here are two thematic parts to Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth that I think are really important. So the first one comes from Norse mythology. It's the idea of long defeat. So the two kind of don't go together. So defeat, but you keep on being defeated. So in this sense, it's the idea that victory is never final. And so we see this in the earth, Middle-earth as a whole. There's the first age, second age, third age. Each age has its own really important victories, but then evil keeps on coming back. Elrond in Lord of the Rings uses the phrase the long defeat. He's been there for thousands of years. He has seen evil defeated repeatedly.
Why won't you die?
And then it keeps on coming back. And so it's kind of a pessimistic view of the world that is popular in Norse mythology. But at the same time, I think it's a highly Christian view because it emphasizes the pervasiveness of sin. So one generation might do a great job bringing the gospel to places and building a church and so on, but sin is always going to be present. And so this long defeat is the idea that we should continue to seek to change the world in a variety of ways, but we're never going to be able to change it completely. Like, we can't make new creation by ourselves. And so we see this in the book in a variety of ways. And even with things like at the end of the book, Frodo, he has to leave Middle-earth. He has saved the world, but not for himself. And so even the victory has consequences. Galadriel, Elrond, the Elves, they all leave Middle-earth. And so, yes, there's victory, but it's not a clean-cut victory in that sense. He actually started writing a sequel to Lord of the Rings. It's called The New Shadow. And he got maybe 20 pages into it and then stopped because he quickly realized this long defeat. Evil is back, and we're just doing the same thing all over again. Like, I don't want to write the story all over again. And so he stopped writing the sequel, never finished it, probably for good reason. And so this, I think, thoroughly Christian idea is really helpful because it reminds us we should strive to change the world for Jesus, but we are never going to be able to do it ourselves. Like, evil is pervasive and it's always going to be present. So that's one. On the flip side is something that the word he created, eucatastrophe. So catastrophe, of course, is this negative term. Eu is a Greek word for good. So good catastrophe is what he comes up with. So he's got this whole essay on eucatastrophe, and he talks about how it's commonly found in fairy stories, and he's got many of them in Middle Earth as well. And so here's an example of him talking about a eucatastrophe from Middle Earth.
I quote,
"In the scene where all the hosts of the West unite to honor and praise the hobbits, we reach the eucatastrophe of the whole story. That is the sudden, joyous turn and fulfillment of hope, the opposite of tragedy. That should be the hallmark of a fairy story, the resolution and justification of all that has gone before it. It brought tears to my eyes as I write it and still moves me." So eucatastrophe is this sense of impending doom, and at the very last minute, all of a sudden everything is saved. And so this kind of surprise, twist, good ending. And so we see this all the time in stories, right? Where when it seems darkest, that's when the good news comes and victory is at hand.
Kind of like the Two Towers or the Battle of Helm's Deep.
March to Helm's Deep!
Helm's Deep, exactly. So just the last minute, eucatastrophe, the other forces come to help them. And what's fascinating is how Tolkien then ties this into Christianity. So he calls the resurrection the greatest eucatastrophe, like the true eucatastrophe, where when everything seems dark on Saturday, when Jesus is dead and in the grave, but then all of a sudden the death of Jesus is the very thing that brings life to the world. And so the resurrection is the great eucatastrophe. And so the story is set up on the one hand to show the long defeat of evil is pervasive and always going to be there, but then eucatastrophe gives us hope in the middle of that seeming defeat that's coming.
Wow. There's a lot to process, but yes, I think I would agree with all that. That the gospel is the greatest new catastrophe. You're talking about the Greek letter, right? That
EU. So EU. So catastrophe EU. With an EU in front. U. Yeah.
U. Okay. I was thinking about the Greek letter alphabet. That sounds like new. So don't confuse it with new.
U catastrophe. Yeah.
All right.
EU.
So what is the gospel story? I guess this kind of touches to this. Like what is the gospel in his storyline and how is it unfolding? You know, obviously we talked about the catastrophe where there's a surprising victory out of darkness. But in terms of the good news of the gospel, how as Tolkien understood it, being a Roman Catholic, right? And I think there could be probable a really good debate against that, whether if he understood it clearly, you know, because I think it would be hard for someone to understand the true active obedience of Christ, right? If you take away the active obedience of Christ in the gospel, then I guess the gospel does diminish a lot for someone who says, the active obedience is not really about the active, it's, you know. So that's where you get into the Roman Catholics, right? Stuff of works plus grace and all that stuff. I guess we're going back to the Roman Catholic and Protestant debate there. So just put that aside. What was his gospel presentation, if any, in his work?
So let me take a step back and think about how he would view Middle Earth in the context of our world. Kind of what is the connection? So a little bit of history. He read an Old English poem, what's the name of it? Christ. So 8th century, so quite old. And here's what this one line says.
I quote,
"Hail Arundel, brightest of angels, above the middle earth sent unto men." So he saw this line, and then he created a poem based on this line. And in this poem, Arundel is a character in the story. So he sent this poem. This is just before World War I, or as World War I is starting. He sent this poem to his friend, and his friend says, "What is this about? What is happening here?" And Tolkien's response was classic. He said, "I don't know. I will try and find out." And so Tolkien's always, it's as if he's discovering things. He's not inventing them. He's discovering them. And so this is the beginning of Middle Earth. And so Arundel is an important character in the first stage. And it's the stories of the Silmarillion are about explaining the kind of world that Arundel would live in. And what Tolkien's original idea was that this would be a mythology for England. So other countries had their mythology, their kind of mythic history. England didn't have one. And so he wanted to create his own mythology for England. And so it's tightly connected to England in a variety of ways. But what happened is, as time went on, it became more disconnected from England and more connected to the real world. And so he began to think of Middle Earth as, it kind of already was, I suppose, but the England part became de-emphasized. And it was more about that being our world just way back in time. And so much of his revisions later on in life are connecting or kind of changing Middle-earth to match what our world is today in a variety of ways. So with that background, if Middle-earth is kind of before recorded history for us, then in that sense, there can't be a Jesus character because it's pre-Jesus. And so he's viewing Middle-earth the same way he's viewing something like Beowulf. So Beowulf is pre-Christian in a sense. So there's Christian influence, but probably Christian scribes and so on. So these are pagans who, in a sense, are waiting to learn about the gospel, but they don't know about the gospel yet. And so the Middle-earth is something similar. So you don't have clear gospel stories like you do in Chronicles of Narnia with Aslan and the stone table and so on.
Wait, no, don't. This is something about the stone table.
And partly that's just because of how Middle-earth is set up. This is before the gospel, before Jesus comes. And so you can't put Jesus into the story before he actually shows up in history. So in that sense, there's no clear story like us Protestants would want to see. Having said that, let me talk about one further part of the story that I think is a fundamental part of the gospel, though. And this is victory through weakness. So fairy stories are often about power. Who can get power, and powerful people tend to win the day, and so on. So Tolkien is often subverting power in all kinds of ways. So in Lord of the Rings, there's lots of examples of that. So the hobbits.
The hobbit?
The hobbits are some of the main characters, but they are not powerful in any definition. But Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, they're the ones who, in a sense, save the world. The wizards
I'm Gandalf the Grey.
Are sent because, and they're not, let me just read this quote about the wizards, because this is helpful.
I quote,
The wizards were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open displays of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were commanded to advise and persuade men and elves to do good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, should endeavor to dominate and corrupt. So the wizards are really powerful, but they're not to use that power. They're instead supposed to come in humility and seek to change people. And so all the way through Lord of the Rings and the entire, I think, threads of Middle-earth, everything about Middle-earth is weakness is the way to victory. And of course, this is the heart of the gospel. We see this all the time in the Old Testament, where, say, the Israelite king is commanded to be weak, not to be military powerful, and so on. And then this is the heart of the gospel as well. Jesus comes and defeats death by dying. So we don't have a gospel parallel directly, but I think, in a sense, the heartbeat of the gospel shows up in Middle-earth through this sense of victory through weakness.
This question was submitted to me. So it says, do you think Tolkien purposely made characters like Gandalf, Aragorn, Frodo to display the three offices of Christ as prophet, priest, and king? Like, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure he, was familiar with English history, and he probably read the Westminster, and you know what I mean? He probably read all the stuff. I don't doubt he never read that stuff. I'm sure he has, even though he probably disagreed with it. I'm sure he's like, oh yeah, prophet, priest, and king. I could see that as a Roman Catholic, easy. So do you think those characters kind of display a little bit of the threefold offices of Jesus, being Frodo being like a sacrifice kind of thing, like a sacrificial character, very weak, very, and then like I think Aragorn is like the king kind of character-ish. What do you think about this question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we actually know the answer to this. It's emphatically no.
Nope.
Because someone asked him this question, and he said no.
Really?
But he said, that works. I like it. And so he said he did not intend it, but he is willing to buy the comparison of Aragorn as king, Frodo as priest, Gandalf as prophet. So this is, once again, Tolkien is so thoroughly infused with Christianity, even when he doesn't intend it, it kind of comes out his pores, in a sense, in the story.
Okay.
And I think these parallels are really helpful. Philip Ryken, who's the president at Wheaton College, wrote a book a few years ago, and this is his argument right here. And I think he makes a lot of good points. It's called The Messiah Comes to Middle-earth. And so he talks about these
I think
parallels.
I've heard of it. That sounds very familiar. I'll drop the link in the bottom after this. And talking about the doctrine of God, this is very interesting. Like, how do we see God, God's providence, and I think the God of of Middle Earth, or the creation of Middle Earth, is how you pronounce it? The Ulvatar?
Iluvatar.
Iluvatar. Sorry.
Iluvatar.
Sorry, my what kind of language is that? Is that Elvish or what is that?
Yeah, this is Elvish.
Okay, my Elvish is not very good looking, so sorry for all that, all the people out there. So, how do we see God's providence still throughout the whole storyline of the Middle Earth and the world there, and why is it not really mentioned as much in the trilogy as in comparison to other books like the Silmarillion, like you were saying?
Okay, so here we have to get a little geeky, so I apologize.
That's
in
fine. That's
advance.
okay.
So Silmarillion
Geek
begins
alert.
with the creation of the worlds. It's called the Ainulindale. And in the creation of the world, it's thoroughly monotheistic. So Iluvatar creates the worlds, ex nihilo. This is the god character of Middle Earth creating the world. But what's slightly different is the angels play a somewhat greater role in the creation account. The creation account is one of the best parts of the Silmarillion. It's a great read. It involves singing, creation through singing, and we get the Satan character in, messing things up. It's just fascinating how Tolkien portrays it all together. But what's interesting is in the Silmarillion, once you start getting into the first stage with the elves in Middle Earth and so on, even there, Iluvatar becomes pretty distant. And so the earth is run more directly by a group of angels. They're called the Valar in Middle Earth. And so Iluvatar is distant even there. And then when we get to Lord of the Rings, Iluvatar is never mentioned, and the Valar become pretty distant. So Elbereth is the one Valar who's mentioned in Lord of the Rings. But just in general, it becomes more and more focused on providential control rather than God, Iluvatar, doing things directly.
Things are now in motion that cannot be undone.
Partially, I think Tolkien does this because he doesn't want to repeat the Old Testament in a sense. Like, he wants to give God space to be God, but not write stories for him, perhaps. Perhaps some other reasons as well. God remains distant. But there's a strong sense of destiny, fate, providence, and so on. And so in Lord of the Rings, you get statements about, like, meant. Maybe you were meant to have it, and so on.
You know this, don't you, Gandalf?
And so in the context of Middle Earth, it's pretty clear this is a Iluvatar or a Valar in the background who meant it to happen, who sent Gandalf, and so on. So if you don't have the Silmarillion, it's easy to kind of skip over those, just kind of say, I don't know what that means. But in the context of Middle Earth as a whole, clearly this is divine sovereignty, divine providence, Iluvatar directing events, even though he's not directly mentioned.
Basic question from someone in the audience: are the elves angels, and if not, who does the elves represent?
The elves are not angels.
Ah, man.
So the angels are the Valar and the Maiar. So these are a separate group of beings. Now, what's interesting is there are several Maiar in Lord of the Rings. So Gandalf is a Maiar. So that means Gandalf is an angel. Sauron is a Maiar. So Sauron's also an angel. So there's a few of them that show up in Lord of the Rings, even if they're not called Maiar there. The elves and the humans and the hobbits and the dwarves, they all are parallel in a sense to humans, kind of, maybe different aspects. In Middle Earth, the main difference is the elves don't suffer natural death, so they're tied to Middle Earth in this really concrete way, to the point where there's elvish reincarnation, where if an elf dies, they come back. And Tolkien debates with himself about how exactly this works and so on. But for elves, they're tied to Middle Earth, and then the humans are the ones who die and are able to leave Middle Earth. But both with the dwarves, hobbits, and so on, they're in a sense different aspects of humans, but he never really talks about, like, which aspect is it. So they're, in our world, in a sense, they're parallel to humans, so not angels.
And then this question: is Sauron based on Satan? Is Sauron the devil? Is he the devil?
No, because there is a Satan character whose name is Melkor, and in the creation account, he is the one pretty similar to the traditional idea of Satan, where he's a highly powerful angel.
An angel?
And he eventually gets ideas of glory for himself and starts corrupting everything around him, and then draws people unto himself. And and so on. And some of these people that he draws are from the Maiar, which is the second class of angels. And one of them is Sauron. So Sauron is kind of Melkor's lieutenant. He's number 2 devil, perhaps, something like
Number
that.
2.
And so he originally
All right.
has a human form, but then he loses that before we see him in Lord of the Rings. He's kind of put his essence into the ring. And so that's why he disappears when the ring is destroyed, is because he has put himself into the ring in this really unique way.
Does the ring, does it represent sin, or what does the ring represent in the Lord of the Rings?
The ring of power within my grasp.
So this is precisely the kind of question Tolkien does not want us to ask.
Okay,
It
sorry about
certainly
that.
it certainly works for sin. One Tolkien scholar talks about it in terms of addiction, which is a really interesting idea, because the ring doesn't affect everyone equally. Some people it is barely affecting them at all. Others it affects them almost immediately. So it kind of depends on what kind of attitude do you bring to the ring, how long do you have it, and so the addiction might be a good model for how we think about it. You could also think about the final scene of Lord of the Rings where Frodo puts on the ring.
Destroy it!
Is that a moral failure? Like, what happens there? But I think one possible way of explaining it is almost like demon possession. This is no longer a place where Frodo has a choice. In a sense, it just overcomes him. And so that could possibly be a way to read that part of the story as well.
Closing thoughts on the Lord of the Rings that people should know about? Anything you want to highlight again for people out there interested in it?
Yeah, I love the story. I encourage everyone to read it. I read it every year. It's just a great part of my year to go through it again. There's always some new quote that I see. That's a beautiful part. To some extent, I think the long nature of the story is part of the message of the book, kind of the long defeat. By the time you get to the end and the victory, you have earned that victory. You made it through this book, and we can feel the joy with the characters as well. There's so many beautiful parts of Lord of the Rings. I love the characters and so on. Maybe just one quotation that's been encouraging to me. As the party leaves Rivendell, I think it's Gandalf says to Merry,
I quote,
"You're going to come across many unexpected feasts along the way." And we see this throughout the book where there's long periods of not much food and danger, but then you get these occasional feasts when they come to these places, like when they meet Faramir and so on. And so that's just a great image of life. Like we face these long periods of danger and stress and so on, but God gives us these unexpected feasts, and just to be thankful for them and to have an image of something like that in Lord of the Rings. So lovely book. Yeah, I just encourage everyone to read it and sit with it for a while.
Awesome. Anyway, so with that, I'll catch you on the next one. God bless. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And now check out the links below. I'm selling some gear, some t-shirts on TeePublic and Redbubble, and hopefully soon on Amazon. So check it out. Follow the link below and cop you a couple of shirts. All right. God bless. Catch you at the next one.